A very warm welcome once again to my esteemed listeners. Today, in this lecture series on Bankimchandra Chattopadhyay, we have arrived at the final lecture, which is attempting a critical assessment of the ideas and thoughts of Bankimchandra Chattopadhyay. We are going to attempt a critical assessment of the contributions of Bankim to social thought, social thinking. Since this is a critical assessment, we are going to discuss both the positive and the negatives of the ideas of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. Let us remember that it is not possible, it is something that is very commonly said actually in social sciences, that there can be no idea or concept or theory or thinker who is beyond criticism or above criticism. Bonkim was no exception in this regard. Of course, not all his ideas are totally acceptable or totally accurate or totally relevant in today's date and time, but we cannot deny the fact that in very many cases, Bonkim was a pioneer. And in this lecture, we are going to discuss both the positive contributions as well as certain limitations that his thoughts suffered from. To begin with, we shall first focus upon the drawbacks or the limitations in the ideas of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. And what goes without saying is the first and the foremost criticism that is brought up against Bankim, he still remains known as one of the key proponents of Hindu revivalism, and many have criticized him for looking at the past to salvage the present and the future of his country. And this emphasis upon a single religion or a single religious community to resurrect a politically subjugated country has drawn severe criticism from modern secular liberal social scientists or thinkers. His thoughts remain confined within the worlds or boundaries of Bengali and Hindu identity, and he never quite manages to overcome these identities to assume a more pan Indian or secular character. Now, there are two things, when critics allege that he was primarily a Hindu revivalist. Firstly, the emphasis upon Hindu identity and the emphasis upon Hinduism. The core ideas, concepts, precepts, beliefs, and cultural values associated with one singular religion, that is Hinduism, which of course was and still is the religion of the majority people in the Indian subcontinent, but definitely not the only religion or religious community that is present in the Indian subcontinent. And secondly, the revivalism part. Revivalism essentially is an attempt to not just look at the past and appreciate the past as being glorious or as having been glorious, but actually it is an attempt to bring back what was considered to be good in the past. So both have been criticized, both these aspects. The emphasis on a singular religious community and the culture associated with the people of that religious community, as well as the revivalist part. As in, when someone is a revivalist, he or she or they is not attempting to actually create something new on a new foundation. They know what was good in the past or in the far past or ancient past. They simply want to recreate the good or the positives of the past, and they think that that is going to be a solution to all the problems that are, sort of encumbering the present of a particular community. So that's the problematic, okay, of revivalism. Hindu revivalist Bunkim was, and this remains, or one of the first criticisms that are brought up against him. Moreover, there is also not just this excessive emphasis upon Hindu identity, but at places in his essays, there are places where he uses the terms Hindu, Bengali, Bharatvarshiya, that is somebody belonging to Bharatvarsha, as interchangeable terms. So there is a certain amount of confusion, there is a certain amount of lack of precision when it comes to who it is that Bonkim exactly wishes to address. Only the Bengalis, only the Bengali Hindus, only the Hindus, all of the people who were Bharatvarshiyas because they lived in Bharatvarsha. There is a certain kind of haziness which Bunkim fails to resolve till his very last days of writing social essays. Next, Bonkim's emphasis on the importance of society. And there are places, there are certain essays in which he lays an extreme amount of importance upon society, social customs, norms, conventions, and to the extent that he believes that, there are wrongs happening in society or negative practices prevalent in a society, but then they can be cured, they can be done away with without the intervention of the state. There are times when Munkim emphasizes upon the importance of society to be more in relation to the importance of the state. He explicitly states that the individual's obligation to society is far more than his obligation to the political institution of the state. Now, this emphasis on the importance of the state is essentially correct or correct in its essentials, but the way Bunkim underplayed the role of the state, its sovereignty, its capacity to make laws, and overall control that a state exercises over a populace is rendered irrelevant and inadequate in today's perspective. Completely. Not to say that society is important, we are perhaps dealing with the new avatar of society in the form of civil society. These particular essays where Bonkim underplays the role of the state in today's day and time, they are absolutely inadequate to explain the realities of the modern day state apparatus. As far as Bonkim's ideas on the colonial economy and its impact on India are considered, here we have to grant great concessions to Bonkim. He was definitely far from correct when he surmised that India had gained more foreign capital and her economic losses were few during the colonial period. This is rather difficult to explain as to why Bonkim thought so. But he actually tries to go into vivid details by giving examples. If the British had not established trade relations with India, then many of the products that are available in India would never have found a foreign market. Now, when he says products, perhaps these are agricultural commodities, agricultural products, goods, raw materials, etc. These would not have found a foreign market for themselves. Now, this is factually incorrect because even before the arrival of the British in India, Indian merchants did trade with other countries, other nations, and the trade was of various items or in various items, be it textiles, be it spices, be it cotton or jute or silk, etc. There are ample historical records and examples of India having traded on her own terms with the rest of the world, with many other parts of the world. So, to say that had the British not come to India, had India not undergone the colonial experience, India would not have gained more, foreign capital is a factually incorrect analysis. Also, the fact that Bonkim points out that India's economic losses were few, this too is factually incorrect. Due to colonial rule, the economic losses that India faced were few. Now, this too is factually incorrect because the extreme amount of stagnation that Indian agriculture underwent, particularly because of the laws and policies created and followed by the British colonial masters in India, are also very vividly document and are quite evident. So it is difficult to explain as to how Bunkim came to this conclusion that the impact of colonial economy on India was good rather than bad. Some of his successors, some of his predecessors, and some of his contemporaries were proposing the theory, the drain theory, which is they were trying to prove that the British rule in India was actually bleeding, the wealth of India and leading to extreme stagnation and impoverishment and pauperization of all sections of India, including intellectual. So while Ram Mohan Roy, Dadabhai Nauroji were actually quite vocal about the draining of wealth of India, Bonkim chose to take the opposite path, but he fails to give necessary proof of his statement or his perception of how the colonial economy had impacted India. Also, in the same line of thought, or continuing in the same line of thought, Munkim goes on to say that this exposure that India had to the foreign markets, immense amount of wealth was earned from foreign trade thanks to the British, but sadly, not all of this wealth was distributed to all the sections of people of India. Okay, sadly, it remained confined in the hands of a few zamindars. That was the sad part. If the zamindars could be convinced to share their wealth with the rest of the populace, then perhaps Indians would realize how beneficial the colonial economy actually was. I would say a half baked analysis of the colonial economy and its impact on India. Now, moving on from Bunkim's ideas, the limitations of Bunkim's ideas on the importance of society and the role of the state in India, as well as having discussed, Bunkim laid the foundation of deification of the polity and politicization of the deity in his imagination of India as a motherland, as a deity in Anandamot. While it was important to make it easy for the diverse population of India to be able to imagine belonging to a single political entity in order to engender the spirit of patriotism and nationalism, this identification of the political entity of the state with a mother deity who is worthy of being worshipped obviously rendered religious intonation upon the imagination of India. And this trend of deifying the polity made any secular imagination of the state impossible for all time to come. We are suffering from the impact of this particular trend even today. We hardly have any perception of India in our mindscape, in our mental space, where we do not see India as our not just motherland, but as a deity that we should worship. So the secular imagination of India has been seriously hampered. Next, we have to look at Bonkim's perception on the importance of history in the making of a nation. Now, undoubtedly, having historical record of past achievements is an indispensable first step towards constructing its present and future. Bonkim's repeated allegations that the attempts of European Muslim chroniclers in discrediting whatever written records India had of her past are also correct to a very large extent. Yet, can we honestly claim that Bonkim himself adhered strictly to historical facts when he was writing his most popular novel, Anandamot? He uses the Sannyasi rebellion as a loose point of reference to create the general backdrop of the novel, but uses creative liberty, maybe literary license, to give the novel the flavor of patriotism that he particularly desired. So, if he could pay a cursory reference to historical facts, how could he bring up the allegation against, European and Muslim chroniclers when they tried to discredit whatever written records India had of her past? We have to think on it. Furthermore, despite his best attempts, Bunkim's ideas on nation remain blurred, hazy. His exhortations on developing the spirit of patriotism or nationalism have been labeled as a derivative discourse and as he has fundamentally failed to develop any original or indigenous categories of or on nationalist discourse. His emphasis on a common collective history, a contiguous geopolitical space, a homogeneous culture, especially with reference to religion and language, are all categories that have been created in the West to create and propagate the concept and theory of nationalism. So, and hence the allegation that this was a derivative discourse. Munkim's discourse on nationalism was a derivative discourse. Next, let us look at Bunkim's views on modernity. While we appreciate the fact that Bunkim attempts a critical evaluation of European modernity, despite being a native of a European colony, we have to take a deeper look at his conclusion that the best of the West, that is, knowledge of the world and knowledge of the self, ought to be combined with the best that the East had, that is, knowledge of God, in order to create the perfect and the more complete man. Partha Chatterjee, in a book that he publishes in 1986, raises the same question. A perennial problem in all nationalist thinking: how does one accept what is valuable in another's culture without losing one's own cultural identity? And this, remains unanswered. In our discussion on Onkim's evaluation of European modernity, we have seen, and as well as his views on the colonial experience of India, we have already seen how Bonkim strives to, strike a balance and create a synthesis of the best that the West has to offer and the East has to offer. When from the West, he believes that, knowledge of the world, by knowledge of the world, he is referring to various branches of natural sciences like mathematics, physical sciences, physics, chemistry, etc. And the knowledge of the self, he is referring to the various branches of the social sciences, politics, sociology, economics, geography, etc. And he wants a combination of these various branches of knowledge with India's spirituality, India's philosophy, and the core values of the Bhagavad Gita. Right now, when this cultural confluence is taking place, it is very pleasing to hear and very appealing to imagine that such a cultural confluence and synthesis is being proposed. But the question raised by Partho Chatterjee cannot be completely denied or rejected. It cannot be ignored. It is indeed a problem as to come to a conclusion. How do you accept another's culture, another's knowledge, without losing a part of your own cultural identity? Bonkim fails to answer this question. Though Bonkim began as a rationalist positivist thinker, deeply influenced by the positivism and post Enlightenment values of Europe, he changed the course of his thinking in later life, taking refuge to creative imagination wherever it suited him to do so, in matters of social and political imagining, as well as in analyzing the foreign rule and its impact over India. Now, it is not that such inconsistencies are, very rare and they do not happen or hardly ever happen among social science thinkers, but it must be observed and noted that Bunkim could not create any new analytical constructs to give potence to his views on the supremacy of Indian slash Hindu ideas, systems, cultural practices, but he merely rejects Western evaluation of these as racially biased and ahistorical. The last point in this regard, that is, as far as we are talking about the limitations in the ideas of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, that I wish to draw the attention of my listeners to is the question of women, their position and role in India. Now, in the context of the latter's colonial encounter, of course, here too we notice grave inconsistencies. Despite being deeply influenced by John Stuart Mill's The Subjection of Women, and despite penning strong women characters like Kollani in Anandamot, Tilottama and Aisha in Durgesh Nandini, Matongini in Rajmohan's Wife, Bonkim fails to go the full length and accord equality of status and opportunity to his fictional female characters. He also opposed the attempts at social reforms or legislations that were aimed at improving the social and economic position of women. Now, this is a strange dilemma. His fictional literary characters who are women are often very strong, very ahead of their times, and in stark contrast to their male counterparts quite often. Despite such portrayal, he doesn't go the full length. That is, he does not show a strong, independent, opinionated woman as taking her place or position of authority at the end of his novels. They are mostly subservient to their, if I may say so, inferior or less superior male counterparts. They are mostly abiding by the societal constructs and norms that are dictated for women, right? So he was very deeply influenced by John Stuart Mill and his ideas of liberty, etc. He was also influenced by the John Stuart Mill had expressed in the Subjection of Women about giving women the right to suffrage because they were as much subject to laws made by the state as their male counterparts. Despite being under Mill's influence, Wong-Kim is unable to overcome his inherent and perhaps spontaneous inferior perception of women, and he does not also support social reformers attempts to sort of, let's say, do away with child marriage or do away with or introduce widow remarriage. He believes that if a certain amount of education is given to women, education for all, in fact, would change societal norms, societal understandings, and that would be adequate enough. The state would not have to intervene, laws would not be required, and women need not become rebellious about wanting to change their social positions overnight in India, right? So here too is a grave limitation on part of Bunkim. Now, enough of the limitations that we have discussed. Let us move on to the positive aspects of the ideas of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. First and foremost, let us appreciate the fact that despite being a product of Western education in 19th century Bengal, in colonial India, and being in the imperial services, Bunkim did not accept uncritically all that was espoused in the name of Western reason and rationality or modernity. True that he too spoke of the same essentialist categories of the non Western individuals or cultures, yet he cannot be held accountable for apprehending what Orientalism would espouse in the following century. Also, none can deny the fact that Anandamot and especially Vande Mataram still strike a patriotic chord in the hearts of all Indians. Now, another point that we need to acknowledge about Bankim's positive contribution is that a point that is often brought out as a criticism, that when he was trying to critique Western modernity, he in a way tried to capture the essentialist characteristics or essences of the non-Western individuals, cultures, civilizations. Now, this is something that in the next century, in the following century, the Orientalists, as I had already discussed in the episode on Bankim's ideas on colonial rule in India, I had mentioned in that particular episode also, Edward Said had introduced the critical concept of Orientalism, wherein he does the same thing. Okay, he does the same thing, that is, he tries to analyze and break down the way in which the non West was looked upon by the West. Okay, and how exactly that looking upon the non West was essentially an act of racial prejudice. Also, the theory of Orientalism emphasizes upon bringing out the essentialist categories that can define and that has glorified the non-West, the East, and tried to establish the fact that it is not true that whatever is non Western is not civilized or not progressive or not developed. Now, of course, we cannot hold Bankimchandra Chattopadhyay alone responsible for the fact that, in the succeeding century, some new social science thinker would come up with a theory that would completely be based upon identifying this essentialist category of the non-Western individuals or cultures. This is definitely not something that we can accuse or rather allege that this was a drawback of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay. It must be remembered that though Bonkim could not devise or construct any new categories to define and analyze the concept and phenomena of modernity and nationalism, yet he did lay the foundation of a nationalist discourse in India that strove to mark a moment of departure from the dominant theoretical discourses of the day. With this, we come to the end of this lecture where we have taken into consideration and discussed both the limitations and the positive contributions of Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay towards developing a nationalist discourse in India, as well as his ideas on society, religion, customs, philosophy, economy in colonial India. And I hope it has been an enriching learning experience for all of us.
After hearing the lecture, let's see if we can answer the questions.